They climbed the mountain carrying nothing but worn-out tools and the fragile hope of a fresh start, but what the land demanded of them in return would alter their souls forever. Would you have the courage and the strength needed to leave the comfort of the city behind and build an entire life from scratch in a place where the biting wind seems to drive away even the bravest of hearts? This journey of profound resilience, sweat, and true love took place on the freezing, majestic slopes of the Blue Ridge Mountains, near the small town of Black Mountain, North Carolina, in the unforgiving autumn of 1913. Before we witness every log raised and every obstacle overcome by this extraordinary couple, I have a very special request for you. Leave the name of your city and state down in the comments below, because I read every single message, and I absolutely love knowing how far across the country our stories are traveling. And if you are the kind of person who is deeply moved by tales of struggle, where honest hard work and sincere affection conquer life's greatest trials, go ahead and leave a like on this video and subscribe to the Tales of Yesteryear channel so you never miss any of our journeys into the past. The smell of dust and old fabric hung heavily in the air of the small shop on Black Mountain's main street, mixing with the bitter scent of cold coffee that had been forgotten on the oak counter. Cecilia Barnes, at 23 years of age, ran her pale fingertips over the scratched wood, feeling the familiar texture of the place she had called home her entire life. The chilling October rain beat against the fogged window panes, creating a constant melancholic drumming that perfectly matched the tightness in her chest. Her father, Theodore Barnes, had passed away less than a month ago, taken by a sudden fever that respected neither the apothecary's tonics nor a daughter's fervent prayers. But Theodore hadn't just left behind a profound longing and an irreparable void in the young woman's life. He had left ledger after ledger filled with nervous handwriting, detailing immense debts to the textile suppliers in New York and to the local bank. The town clerk, a man with a thick mustache and an impatient glare, had been there that very morning. He cleared his throat dryly before announcing that the grace period had come to an end. With a bureaucratic voice, completely devoid of compassion, he explained that the shop, the house in the back, and even the rolls of linen and calico would be seized by the bank in exactly 3 days. Cecilia took a deep breath, swallowing the lump in her throat, and asked in a fragile whisper if there wasn't any alternative, any arrangement that could be made so she could at least keep the roof under which she was born. The man shook his head, adjusted his glasses, and replied that a debt of $800 was far too large for any banker's pity. While Cecilia packed the few clothes the bank allowed her to take on the other side of the small town, the heavy, rhythmic sound of an axe splitting firewood echoed in the yard of a modest carpentry shop. August Miller, a 25-year-old man with broad shoulders and hands sculpted by hard labor, brought the steel blade down on a hickory log with terrifying precision. The sweet, woody scent of sawdust clung to his raw cotton clothes, while sweat glistened on his forehead, despite the cold wind rolling down from the ridge. August was a man of deep silences. The whole town knew of his skill with wood, capable of making perfect joints without using a single iron nail, but very few knew the sound of his laugh. He had lived alone since the passing of his own father, old Sebastian, a dreamer who had spent his life saving every copper penny he earned. Sebastian's dream wasn't the town, nor the carpentry shop. His dream was White Pine Ridge, a plot of untamed land, isolated and proud, nestled deep within the Blue Ridge Mountains at an elevation of nearly 6,000 feet. Sebastian had bought that land with the sweat of a lifetime, dreaming of building a prosperous farm there, far from the greed of city men. But the old carpenter's heart had failed before the first foundation stone was laid. August stopped his axe in midair, wiped his face with the back of his calloused hand, and looked toward the mountain peak, which was partially hidden by a dense, silvery mist. He had inherited the land, the wax-sealed deed, and the unfinished dream. But climbing the ridge alone to face the brutal winter that was fast approaching seemed not just a challenge, but almost a sentence of failure. Fate has a curious, often painful way of crossing the paths of people who are on the verge of falling. That same Tuesday afternoon, Cecilia was walking toward Mrs. Mercer's boarding house, dragging a battered leather suitcase containing everything she had left in the world. The icy wind whipped her face, and the weight of humiliation made her shoulders slump. The town seemed to have closed its doors to the ruined merchant's daughter. No wealthy family wanted to hire her as a governess, and distant relatives had ignored her telegrams for help. It was exactly at the corner of the street by the main church, near the woodworking shop, that the handle of her old suitcase finally gave way. The leather snapped with a dry crack, scattering a few items of clothing, a woolen shawl knitted by her mother, and 2 poetry books onto the damp, dusty street. Cecilia fell to her knees, feeling the hot tears of despair finally overflow, staining her exhausted face. She tried to gather her things quickly, her hands trembling with cold and shame. It was at that moment that a massive shadow blocked out the pale autumn sun. August had stepped out the door of the carpentry shop. He didn't say a word at first. He just walked with heavy steps toward her, knelt down with the agility of someone accustomed to manual labor, and began helping her collect her belongings. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the sound of dry leaves dragged by the wind. Cecilia, still on her knees, looked at the man's hands. They were hands marked by old scars, thick knuckles, and nails stained with dirt and resin, yet they held her woolen shawl with an absolute delicacy, as if touching something sacred. She whispered a timid thank you, wiping her face with the back of her hand. August lifted his dark, deep eyes, fixing them on the young woman's tired face. He knew her story. The whole town was gossiping about the Barnes family tragedy. He tied the suitcase together with a piece of thick twine he pulled from his apron pocket, making sure it wouldn't pop open again, and stood up. With a deep voice, slightly raspy from lack of use, he asked where she was going with that baggage in the rain. Cecilia looked away toward the packed dirt road, wrapping her arms around her own body to ward off the chill, and answered with a thread of a voice that she was going to try for a room at the boarding house. Hoping to get work in the kitchen to pay for her stay, August stood in silence for a long minute. He looked at the distant mountain, then looked at the fragile young woman, who nevertheless had a gleam of unyielding stubbornness in her almond-shaped eyes. The carpenter took a breath, like someone preparing to lift a very heavy log, and told her that the boarding house was packed with rough drovers coming down from the north, and that she would find no peace in a place full of coarse men. Cecilia felt the despair tighten her throat once more, asking in a pleading tone what he suggested she do, since she had no roof and no family left. It was then that August Miller made the proposal that would change the course of their lives forever. He crossed his broad arms over his chest and, measuring each word carefully so as not to offend her, explained that he owned land up on White Pine Ridge. He told her he needed to head up the mountain in 2 days to start building a cabin and clearing the pasture before the December frost froze the ground solid. August said with brutal honesty that a man alone in the mountains works at half capacity, and that he needed someone to tend the camp, cook the food, and who had the courage to brave the isolation while he raised the walls. He swallowed hard and added, the tips of his ears turning slightly red with shyness, that if she agreed to climb the mountain with him and work on building that home, the land and the cabin would belong to them both in equal shares. He promised, looking deep into her eyes with an unshakable seriousness, that he would never disrespect her, and that they would be like partners in an enterprise of survival. Cecilia's eyes widened, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The proposal was sheer madness, to climb the wild ridge with a man she barely knew, to face wild animals, the biting cold and exhausting labor, abandoning once and for all any trace of civilized comfort. But looking at August's solid and dignified expression and remembering the alternative of humiliation in town, the choice became crystal clear. She lifted her chin, wiped away the last tear remaining on her cheek, and answered with a firm voice that she accepted the deal, provided they leave before dawn, so no one in town would have the chance to judge her decision. The journey up the mountain began under the dark cloak of a freezing Thursday morning. The silence of the world was broken only by the soft whinnying of the chestnut mule August had rented to carry the tools, the sacks of flour, the beans, the lard, and their meager belongings. The air of the Blue Ridge Mountains had a different quality. It was thin, sharp, carrying an intense scent of fallen pine cones, wet earth, and green moss. Cecilia walked beside the mule, wearing a thick woolen coat her father had left her, feeling her legs burn with effort at every step up the steep incline. The path wasn't a road, but a winding, narrow trail, swallowed by giant ferns and centuries-old trees, whose canopies blocked out the sun. August walked ahead, clearing the way with a heavy machete, chopping down vines and thorny branches that stubbornly tried to close off the route. He didn't complain about the weight of his own pack, nor the dampness soaking through his leather boots. From time to time he would pause the hike, turn back, and ask with a silent worry if she needed to rest. Cecilia, panting, her hair plastered to her forehead by cold sweat, would always shake her head, lying that she was perfectly fine. She didn't want to be a burden on the very first day of her new life. By noon, the fatigue took its toll. They stopped near a stream with waters so clear and icy they seemed made of liquid crystal. The sound of the water rushing over the grey stones brought a strange peace to that inhospitable environment. August pulled a dented enamel mug from his bag, filled it at the river and handed it to her. When Cecilia's fingers brushed against his for a fraction of a second as she took the mug, she felt an unexpected warmth radiate from that rough hand, a stark contrast to the frigid water. He quickly lowered his eyes, masking the moment by adjusting the load on the mule's saddle. While they silently chewed chunks of hard bread with aged cheddar, Cecilia observed the man who was now her only link to survival. There was a quiet strength in him, a resilience that the earth seemed to demand of anyone who dared to walk upon it. August, in turn, noticed how she hadn't complained about the scratches the thorns had left on her hands, nor the mud staining the hem of her dark dress. He felt a profound respect begin to sprout in his chest, admiring the silent courage of that city woman who now faced the savagery of the mountain without shedding a single tear of regret. It was only at the end of their second day of walking, as the sun hid behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky with shades of deep purple and incandescent orange, that they finally arrived at White Pine Ridge. Cecilia stood at the crest and lost her breath, not from exhaustion, but from the raw majesty of what lay before her eyes. The lot was an immense rolling plateau covered in golden grass that swayed in the strong wind, surrounded by a dense forest of majestic hemlocks that seemed to touch the sky. There was no house, there was no fence, there was not a single sign of human presence, except for some rotting wooden stakes that old Sebastian had driven into the ground years ago. The isolation was absolute, beautiful and terrifying all at once. The wind howled, bringing with it a biting cold that cut through their woolen clothes as if they were made of paper. The monumental challenge they faced became frighteningly real. They didn't just have to build a house, they had to tame an untamable piece of nature before it devoured them. The first night was a test of endurance Cecilia would never forget. August set up a makeshift shelter using a waxed canvas tarp tied between 4 pine trunks, creating a low roof to protect them from the freezing dew. They gathered dry firewood in the dark, carefully feeling their way through the forest. The sound of the first match striking the box and the smell of burnt sulphur were the small miracles of that night. When the flames of the campfire finally rose, illuminating their tired faces and casting dancing shadows on the canvas, a sense of temporary relief washed away their exhaustion. August placed a cast-iron pot over the fire, warming up some pinto bean soup with salt pork. The smell of hot food in the frigid mountain air was the most comforting thing Cecilia had ever experienced. They ate in silence, sitting on fallen logs, close enough for the fire's heat to warm them both, but maintaining a respectful distance. After cleaning the pot, August pulled out his raw wool blanket and settled onto the hard dirt ground outside the shelter, leaving the covered, more protected area entirely to her. Cecilia looked at him, curled up under the bitter cold, and protested in a low voice, saying there was room for both of them under the tarp, and that he would freeze out there. August offered a half-smile, a small, rare smile that lit up his eyes for a moment, and answered softly that he was made of hickory bark, used to the chill, and that she needed to sleep, protected to have strength for the next day. That gesture of silent protection, devoid of ulterior motives and heavy with genuine care, planted the first seed of something far greater than gratitude in the young woman's heart. When the first light of Friday pierced the thick fog covering the plateau, the real work began, and it was brutal. August marked out with stakes and string the exact spot where the cabin would be raised, turning its back to the north wind and facing the sunrise, catching every drop of warmth the mountain could offer. The first phase was digging trenches for the foundation, hacking away at earth compacted by centuries of ice and sun, riddled with thick roots and stubborn rocks. The constant thud of the pickaxe striking stone became the new music of their lives. August struck the ground with relentless force, his back muscles tensing and relaxing in a hypnotic rhythm, while sweat soaked his shirt. Cecilia didn't stand by waiting. She tied the hem of her dress at her waist, laced up her heavy boots, and began collecting the smaller stones he unearthed, carrying them in a woven basket to form the piles that would later be used for the foundation. The weight of the rocks scraped her hands and left her arms numb, but she didn't stop. With every trip, carrying a full basket, she proved to the mountain and to the carpenter that she was no useless damsel. In the days that followed, an exhausting but strangely harmonious routine established itself between them. They woke before the sun, the grass covered by a thin layer of white frost that crunched beneath their boots. While August went into the woods to fell the straight trees that would serve as main pillars, the sound of his axe shattering the dawn's silence, Cecilia tended the fire, brewed strong coffee, and boiled root vegetables for their first meal. She learned to bake cornbread in a cast-iron skillet over the open flames, the scent of toasted batter mixing with the wood smoke. When he returned, dragging massive logs with the mule's help, their meals were eaten in a comfortable proximity. The silence was no longer awkward. It had become a language of its own between them. One afternoon, while trying to lift a particularly heavy stone for the trench, Cecilia lost her balance, and the rock slipped, scraping her forearm and drawing a thin line of blood across her pale skin. She let out a small, contained cry of pain. Before she could blink, August was at her side. He dropped his mattock, took her arm with a gentleness that contradicted his size, and examined the cut, his brow furrowed with worry. He pulled a clean handkerchief from the inner pocket of his vest, went to the nearby stream to dampen it in the cold water, and returned to clean her wound with the softness of someone wiping rare porcelain. He murmured, without looking directly into her eyes, that she needed to be careful, for the mountain didn't forgive distractions. Cecilia watched his face, so close to hers, feeling the man's warm breath against the cold breeze. The firm, careful touch of those calloused fingers sent an unexpected shiver down her spine, a tremor that had nothing to do with the mountain chill. She whispered that she was all right, thanking him for his care with a slightly trembling voice, while a stubborn blush crept up her cheeks. That brief moment of shared vulnerability solidified a mutual trust that 1,000 words could never have built. Within 2 weeks, the stone foundation was ready, strong and deep enough to withstand storms and the fiercest winds. The next step was raising the wooden frame, the skeleton of their home, but it was on the 20th day of work on White Pine Ridge that the feeling of peaceful isolation was abruptly broken. Evening was falling, coloring the clouds a threatening lead grey, when the sound of horse hooves striking the dirt path echoed from the main trail. It wasn't their mule, and it wasn't just one horse. August dropped his handsaw immediately, his posture hardening, and walked over to stand in front of the shelter where Cecilia was storing provisions, forming a natural shield with his own body. Out of the thin mist rising from the slope emerged 2 well-dressed riders, wearing thick woolen cloaks, mounted on formidable purebred horses. The man riding in front, with neatly trimmed grey hair and the haughty posture of someone used to ruling the world, pulled the reins of his black horse, stopping just a few yards from the newly laid foundation. The smell of expensive tobacco and wet leather invaded the air, a scent that belonged to the rich parlours of the city, not this virgin land. The man looked around, evaluating the couple's hard work with narrowed, analytical eyes, before fixing his cold gaze on August. With a polished voice that carried the unmistakable tone of an order disguised as cordiality, he introduced himself as Nathaniel Vance, owner of all the grazing lands that bordered the lower part of the ridge. Nathaniel smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and told August he admired the courage of a young man coming up the mountain with a woman to try his luck. But that white pine was too harsh a land for penniless dreamers. The wealthy man wasted no time beating around the bush. He adjusted his riding gloves and declared, with the absolute confidence of someone who never hears the word no, that the lot contained a water spring vital to his herd during the dry season. Nathaniel pulled a thick paper envelope from inside his coat and explained that inside was enough money for August to buy a new carpentry shop in the state capital, and for the young lady to start her life over in comfort, far from the mud and suffering. He warned them in a terrifyingly calm tone that they should take the money, head down the mountain before the heavy winter snows covered the trails, and leave the land in the hands of someone who actually had the power to master it. August clenched his fists so tightly, his knuckles turned white, his jaw muscles popping with tension, while the biting Appalachian wind suddenly seemed to carry not just nature's chill, but the weight of a threat that would test every stone of that foundation and the very survival of the feelings beginning to bloom between him and Cecilia. The rustic paradise they were building with so much sweat and hope had been discovered, and the real battle for that home was just beginning. The echo of Nathaniel Vance's horse's hooves still seemed to vibrate against the loose stones of the freezing plateau, long after the thick fog had swallowed the arrogant rancher and his silent foreman. The wind howled furiously through the bare branches of the pines and massive hemlocks, bringing a cold that sliced the skin and froze even the bravest thoughts. August Miller stood motionless for a long time, as if his feet were cemented into the dark earth he himself had dug with such hope and sweat. The sweet scent of expensive tobacco and damp leather from the unwanted visitors lingered in the air, clashing violently with the rustic smell of fresh sawdust, accumulated sweat, and wet soil that clung to the carpenter's raw cotton clothes. Cecilia Barnes, still standing a few paces behind August's broad, protective frame, felt her own heart hammering against her ribs like a bird trapped in too small a cage. She recognized that polished, threatening tone of voice. It was exactly the same polite, bureaucratic and ruthless tone used by the clerk who had seized her late father's shop back in Black Mountain, throwing her out into the bitter streets without a shred of pity. That rich man wasn't making a genuine business offer. He was issuing a command, masked as generosity, an eviction sentence disguised as friendly advice. August finally moved, his broad shoulders dropping heavily as he exhaled the breath he'd been holding. He turned his face slowly toward her, his expression hardened by suppressed rage, but his dark eyes softening subtly as they met the young woman's frightened gaze. The carpenter rubbed the back of his neck with a calloused hand, stained with pine pitch, sighing, before explaining in a low voice that Nathaniel owned the only decent wagon road connecting the lower slopes of the ridge to the town. He said that if the rancher decided to lock the gates of the main road with chains and steel padlocks, they would have to descend through the virgin forest in the dead of a brutal winter just to buy a handful of salt or a quart of kerosene. August swallowed hard, shame coloring the tips of his ears, and confessed with painful honesty that the money in that thick envelope could have given her the chance to return to civilization with dignity. Perhaps open a small dress shop in the city and never again have to burn her sensitive hands by the fire every freezing dawn. Cecilia felt her blood boil with sudden indignation, a fury directed not at him, but at the cowardly idea of abandoning the only place that had taken her in. She closed the distance between them with firm steps, ignoring the mud dirtying the hem of her dark wool dress, pointed a trembling finger at the solid stone foundation on the ground, and declared, her voice choked with emotion but brimming with unshakable conviction, that she would rather eat bitter roots and sleep on the hard dirt of this mountain for the rest of her life than accept the poisoned charity of an arrogant man who thought he could buy people's souls. She looked deep into August's intense eyes, lifted her soot-smudged chin, and whispered that she had sealed a sacred pact with him on that rainy day in town, not with the rich rancher, and that she would only leave this land when the cabin was completely finished, with a sturdy roof against the storms and warm smoke rising from the stone chimney. The long, silent, electrically charged look they exchanged in that moment required no further words. There was an implicit promise of deep loyalty forged in the fire of defiance, an invisible bond that was beginning to grow roots far deeper and stronger than those of the ancient trees around them. The following 3 weeks turned into a frantic, desperate race against nature's unforgiving calendar. The month of November dumped a relentless series of cold, freezing, persistent rains over the Blue Ridge Mountains, turning the entire lot into a slippery, treacherous mud pit, testing both of their patience and physical endurance to the absolute limit. They needed to raise the log walls and pack the chinking before the dreaded December frosts froze the moisture in the clay, which would make it absolutely impossible to mold the rustic daub or pack the mud between the wooden timbers. The daily routine became a machinery of survival and extreme physical exertion that began before the sun even peeked over the grey horizon. August would venture into the dense woods with his sharpened axe, felling straight oak and chestnut timbers, dragging the heavy logs with the help of the chestnut mule, while his shoulders throbbed with pain and his clothes became thoroughly soaked by the constant drizzle. The lonely, rhythmic thud of the axe striking hard wood echoed through the valley like the mountain's own heartbeat. Meanwhile, Cecilia, who just 2 months ago was selling fine lace and silk ribbons behind a polished, clean counter, now stomped red clay with bare feet, mixing the loamy earth with handfuls of dry straw and buckets of frigid water hauled from the nearby stream. The biting cold crept up her heels, numbing her limbs until she almost lost the feeling in her legs, but she didn't stop her methodical movements for a single second. The wet, slapping sound of mud being packed against the interwoven branches filled the long, quiet afternoons. On a particularly gloomy Tuesday, when a dense fog swallowed even the dull midday light, the accumulated exhaustion exacted its cruel toll. Cecilia slipped badly on the wet grass while carrying a basket that was far too heavy, filled with mud daubing to patch a gap high up on the wall. She fell heavily to her knees on the sharp stones of the foundation, the basket tipping over and ruining nearly 2 hours of grueling labor. The frustration, the sharp pain in her scraped knees, and the profound exhaustion finally broke the dam of her emotional restraint. She buried her face in her trembling, red, mud-stained hands and began to cry silently, her thin shoulders shaking violently beneath her damp woolen shawl. August was up on a precarious wooden scaffold adjusting a roof truss when he heard the muffled thud of her fall through the rain. He scrambled down the rough wooden rungs with the desperate agility of a wildcat, ran to her, abandoning all his tools up high, and knelt in the thick mud without caring about ruining his heavy cotton trousers. With a gentleness that was startling for hands so large, rough, and battered by hard labor, the carpenter pushed the overturned basket aside with a light shove, took a clean scrap of cloth from his vest pocket, dipped it in a rainwater puddle that had gathered in a concave stone, and returned. He lifted Cecilia's face by the chin with his rough fingertips and began wiping the mud from her cheeks with extremely slow, precise movements, as if terrified of breaking priceless porcelain. August didn't tell her to stop crying, didn't offer empty platitudes saying everything would easily be all right, nor did he demand she be strong all the time. He merely murmured, his voice strangely thick with an emotion he fought to keep contained, that the clay on this mountain was stubborn and hard as stone, but that he was deeply in awe of the unbreakable strength those delicate hands possessed. He confessed in a raspy whisper, looking directly into Cecilia's tear-filled almond eyes, that never in his entire life had he met a woman with such quiet bravery, and that the walls of this cabin were only rising strong because her untamed spirit was holding every piece of earth together. The warmth of his breath formed small white clouds of vapor in the freezing mountain air, brushing softly against her face with every spoken word. Cecilia felt the tears dry almost instantly in her throat, replaced by a sudden, comforting heat that rose up her neck, coloring her face a bright red beneath the remnants of dirt. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a second to take in the unmistakable scent of fresh pine, rain, and clean sweat radiating from the man so close to her, and whispered a fragile thank you, her voice cracking. August held that intense gaze for a fraction of a second longer than simple courtesy required, his dark eyes dropping almost imperceptibly to her trembling lips before returning to her bright, damp eyes. He cleared his throat nervously, stood up quickly as if the ground were burning his knees, extended a firm hand, and pulled her from the mud with a gentle, extremely careful tug. That brief instant of raw vulnerability and mutual protection silently altered the dynamic between them. The respectful distance of the early days had begun to crumble, making room for a timid courtship, veiled in acts of constant care, warming both of their souls in the freezing solitude of the mountains. The need for basic supplies forced a brief pause in the frantic pace of construction. The flour was running out, the salt had clumped from the dampness, and they needed seeds to start a garden before the ground froze solid. August suggested they hike a few miles down to the mid-slope of the mountain, where widow Eleanor Tucker lived, a 56-year-old woman known throughout the region for her wisdom regarding the high country and for growing the best heirloom corn in North Carolina. The descent was made on a Wednesday morning, with the sun finally breaking through the mist and lighting up the fern leaves with a bright, hopeful green. The trail to Eleanor's homestead was narrow, skirting grey stone ravines where crystal-clear water tumbled in furious cascades. When they reached the clearing, they were greeted by the heavenly smell of skillet cornbread baking and strong coffee dripping through a cotton cloth. Eleanor's cabin was small, whitewashed with peeling blue shutters, surrounded by ancient rose bushes that stubbornly bloomed even in the harsh cold. The woman, with her grey hair pinned up in a tight bun and skin weathered by decades of sun and wind, welcomed them on the porch with a broad smile that crinkled the corners of her dark, observant eyes. She insisted they sit on the wooden benches in her outdoor kitchen, poured hot coffee into fired clay mugs, and cut generous slices of the steaming cornbread. While they ate in grateful silence, Widow Tucker looked from Cecilia to August with a quiet astuteness, noting the brief glances they exchanged and the way the carpenter adjusted the shawl over the young woman's shoulders without her having to ask. The widow sighed, wiped her hands on her floral apron, and began recounting the history of those mountains, revealing details the town below preferred to forget. She explained in a firm, rhythmic voice that Nathaniel Vance hadn't grown rich through the sweat of his own brow, but by buying up the promissory notes of small homesteaders during severe droughts and seizing their land when they couldn't pay the exorbitant interest. Eldona sipped her coffee and warned them, looking seriously at August, that the man with the envelope didn't give up easily on a good water spring, and that his polite manners were merely a velvet glove hiding a ruthless iron grip. She advised the young couple to finish the roof as quickly as possible and to lock the invisible gates of their land tight, because when Vance's cattle grew hungry at the end of winter, paper laws would mean very little up on the isolated ridge. Before they left, the kind widow filled the mules' saddlebags with ears of purple corn, cold-resistant pumpkin seeds, pinto beans, and a few slabs of salted meat, refusing the money August insisted on paying. She merely winked at Cecilia, smiled, and said that her payment would be seeing the smoke from their chimney rising strong toward the sky on winter mornings, proving that love and stubbornness could still defeat the greed of the flatland men. If your heart is aching as you root for Cecilia and August to finish building their dream home in the mountains and overcome the cruelty of the powerful, leave a comment now with words of encouragement for our couple, and don't forget to subscribe to the Tales of Yesteryear channel to keep following these deeply moving stories of resilience and romance. The month of December marched in, bringing the first white frosts that covered the plateau like a carpet of shattered glass in the silent pre-dawn hours. The labor had sharpened their senses and molded their bodies to the beautiful brutality of nature. August seemed even larger, his arm muscles defined by the effort of lifting beams, the skin of his face lightly bronzed by the rare sun and weathered by the constant wind. Cecilia, for her part, had lost the pale fragility of a city girl, gaining an upright, proud posture, her dark hair braided tightly so as not to get in the way of her work, and an incandescent spark of vitality in her eyes that exhaustion could not extinguish. The nights became their only refuge for rest, spent inside the main room, which now had its four walls raised, illuminated by the small fire they kept burning in the center of the dirt floor to help the mud daub dry faster. Being isolated from the rest of the world created a growing, comforting bubble of intimacy. On one of those freezing nights, with the wind battering furiously against the thick oak doors installed the day before, August sat near the fire with a piece of hardwood in his hands and a sharp pocket knife. He worked in silence, wood shavings falling to the floor as the shape of a perfectly smooth wooden spoon, ornamented with small leaves carved into the base of the handle, began to emerge beneath his skilled fingers. Cecilia was sitting on the other side of the fire, her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose, darning a nasty tear in the sleeve of August's wool coat with thick thread and a fine needle. The sound of the wind outside made the silence inside feel even more sacred. She tied off the final knot, bit the thread, and walked over to hand him the mended garment. The carpenter paused his carving, brushed the sawdust from his trousers, and took the coat, thanking her with a smile that lit up his entire serious face. In return, he reached out his hand, offering her the newly finished wooden spoon. Cecilia took the utensil, marveling at the smoothness of the sanded wood and the delicacy of the details scooped into the handle. She ran her thumb over the carved leaves, feeling her chest tighten with emotion at this simple gift, yet one so laden with immense meaning, a tool made specifically for the home they were building together. She asked, her voice choked up and a shy smile gracing her lips. How he managed to have the brute strength to raise entire walls during the day and the gentleness to carve something so small at night. August bowed his head, feeling his face grow warm, and answered quietly that the wood always told him what it wanted to be. You just had to have the patience to listen, and that he wanted her to have beautiful things in her kitchen when the house was done. He slowly lifted his eyes, meeting hers through the flickering flames of the fire, and added in a deep tone that his hands only truly found purpose when they built something that made her smile. Cecilia felt a wave of heat wash over her entire body, the air suddenly feeling thin in the small room. It was one of those moments of indirect courtship, pure and intense, where no declaration of love is spoken aloud, but the heart understands exactly the magnitude of what was said between the lines. She sat beside him on the rustic bench, shoulder to shoulder, the warmth of his body radiating through their thick clothes, and together they watched the fire burn through the night, united by an unbreakable bond. But peace won on the mountain always demands a high price to keep. In the first week of January, a cold front sweeping down from the north swallowed the ridge with demonic ferocity. It wasn't just frost. It was a sudden, violent blizzard that turned the landscape into a deadly white desert in a matter of hours. The temperature plummeted drastically below freezing, turning the water in the wooden buckets inside the cabin to solid ice and covering the still unfinished roof with a thick, dangerous layer of snow. At dawn on Monday, August woke with a start to the desperate whinnying of the mule in the small, makeshift stable they had built near the rocks. He pushed the door open with difficulty against the snowdrift that had piled up on the threshold and was met with a devastating sight. The canvas roof of the mule's shelter had torn under the weight of the ice, leaving the animal exposed to the deadly wind. Without a second thought, Cecilia threw her heavy shawl over her shoulders and ran after him, sinking into the soft snow up to her knees. The wind howled in their ears, slicing the skin of their faces like tiny shards of glass. They worked side by side in the blizzard, shouting to be heard over the roar of the gale, pulling the terrified mule out of the destroyed shelter and forcing the stubborn animal into the unfinished stone room that would serve as the cabin's pantry. August's lips were purple with cold, and his hands shook as he tried to untie the frozen knots of the ropes, but Cecilia didn't retreat, using her own body to warm the animal's neck until they were safe within the thick, mud-chinked walls. The crisis of the blizzard proved the strength of the home they had built, but it brought a far greater invisible problem. The remaining dry firewood had gotten almost completely soaked, the main roof was only half done, and their stock of kerosene for the lanterns had run dry. August assessed the situation with a dark look, his shoulders tense. He declared, his voice sharp with worry, that he urgently needed to go down the mountain to get more oil and roofing nails in town before a second storm locked them on the plateau for good. Cecilia begged him to wait for the weather to clear, but he argued that their very survival depended on getting that roof closed before the end of the week. The descent began on a Wednesday morning, with the sun reflecting painfully off the white snow. But the carpenter's journey was abruptly halted halfway down, just below Widow Tucker's land. The main road, the only route wide enough for a loaded mule to pass, was blocked by an immense newly built gate made of heavy oak logs, chained shut with thick steel links and a formidable padlock. A freshly painted wooden sign was nailed to the center beam, warning that the passage was the private property of the Vance Ranch, and trespassers would be met with gunfire. Nathaniel's dark, calculated prediction had materialized at the worst possible moment. He didn't use guns or violent thugs. He used the brutality of nature and property laws to suffocate the young couple in their unfinished fortress, forcing them to surrender out of sheer exhaustion and lack of resources. August stood before the locked gate, blood pounding in his temples and hot rage rising in his chest. A moral dilemma struck hard at the conscience of this honest man. He gripped the heavy axe in his gloved hands. One precise strike to the old chain would solve the immediate problem, but it would make him a criminal in the eyes of town law, giving Nathaniel the perfect excuse the rich rancher needed to have the rural sheriff drag them off the mountain in handcuffs like common bandits. The carpenter took a deep breath, blowing furious puffs of steam into the cold air. He knew brute force wouldn't beat a powerful man's cunning. With a monumental effort of self-control, August stowed the axe on the mule's saddle, turned around, and decided to take the dangerous path, the hidden trail on the steep back slopes of the mountain that Eleanor had mentioned once in a whisper. It was an almost invisible route used by old pioneer drovers centuries ago to avoid the crown's heavy taxes. Too steep, too dangerous, but completely free of the rancher's chains. The fight for the survival of their love and their home on White Pine Ridge was no longer just against the relentless forces of wild nature. It had definitively turned into an absolute test of wit, endurance, and courage against the silent traps of men. Time was running out, the cold was biting into their bones, and the cabin roof still begged to be closed before the true heart of winter awakened. The back trail of the Blue Ridge wasn't a road, nor even much of a path. It was an ancient, almost faded scar on the rocky flank of the ridge, a memory of footsteps repeated by drovers and miners who had crossed those heights 2 centuries prior, when the British Crown demanded heavy tributes for every official shortcut through the mountains. Widow Tucker had mentioned that route one afternoon in a careful whisper, almost by accident, saying only that the old-timers in the area called it the Pine Ridge Trail. It climbed the steepest rocks on the north side, where on autumn nights the fireflies gathered in such numbers in the damp thickets that the brush looked illuminated by 1,000 tiny, trembling flames. It was dangerous to descend in the bitter winter. It was nearly impossible to do it leading a frightened pack mule, but it was the only way that didn't pass through the iron and oak gates of the proud Nathaniel Vance. August pulled the chestnut mule's reins firmly, adjusted the leather bags full of tools and the empty saddlebags he needed to fill with provisions in town, and took one last look at the plateau he was leaving behind. The cabin stood firm and solid against the dirty, lead-colored winter sky, its thick walls of red earth, daubing and hickory beams, already positioned on the roof, waiting only for the wooden shingles and the ridge cap to be truly complete. Through the rustic glass window of the main room, he saw the flickering light of the nearly empty kerosene lantern, a fragile golden dot pulsing against the grey immensity of the mountain. He knew Cecilia was awake, probably darning a piece of clothing or reorganizing their food stash for the 5th time that week, as she did every night before bed, her way of keeping her hands busy while her mind silently processed the world. That simple image, the golden tremor of light in the window of the home they were raising together, squeezed something in the carpenter's chest with a force that surprised him with its intensity. He turned his face toward the dark trail, breathed in the freezing, biting air of the January dawn, and began his descent. The Pine Ridge Trail demanded every ounce of the terrified respect the ancestors paid it. The first 300 yards of descent were down a corridor of massive flat boulders that jutted like the crooked teeth of a sleeping giant's jaw, rendered slick and treacherous by the moisture retained by the underbrush like living sponges. The mule protested with nervous low whinnies from the very first step, its hind legs slipping on the polished stone as August guided it with all the patience and firmness he could muster. The Appalachian wind, funneling through that narrow rock corridor, took on a furious, unpredictable personality, blowing in gusts from unexpected directions, carrying tiny fragments of ice that stung the exposed skin of his face like hot iron pins. The carpenter wrapped a thick scrap of cloth around his ears and the back of his neck, pulled the wide brim of his brown felt hat low over his eyes, and kept going down, step by step, carefully testing every rock with the toe of his boot before shifting his weight onto it. The thick fog rising from the valley turned the path into a maze of vague, threatening shapes, where every fallen trunk seemed a new obstacle and every dark shadow on the stone could be a hole deep enough to snap an ankle. At two critical points during the descent, the trail practically vanished, swallowed by decades of rampant fern growth and thorny vines that had reclaimed the spaces between the rocks like victorious invaders. August hacked through the path with his machete, the dry, precise chops echoing in the fog, while the mule waited motionless a few yards back with the sovereign patience of beasts of burden accustomed to hardship. In one of those blocked sections, while clearing a dense thicket of vines with thorns the size of knife points, the carpenter discovered, half hidden behind the vegetation, a stone marked with deep carvings. 2 crossed lines and a circle, the unmistakable mark of the old colonial drovers, indicating that this path was official, registered, and recognized by the early colonial administration. August ran his fingers over the moss-filled grooves, with a chill on the back of his neck that wasn't just from the cold. That mark was older than either of them, older than Nathaniel Vance's ranch, older than the county itself, and marks like that carried the weight of law in the courthouse archives the rancher prized so much. The carpenter didn't yet know exactly what that meant in legal terms, but the slow, solid intuition, polished by years of honest labor, told him that here lay an argument far more powerful than any physical confrontation. He filed the information away in the quiet recesses of his mind, the same way he memorized the measurements of a piece of lumber he hadn't yet decided where to fit, and continued down the trail, his eyes now sharper for other signs along the way. And he found 2 more. A row of chiseled stones lined up along the edge of a ravine, precisely marking the border of a path that had once been wide enough for 2 wagons to pass side by side. And further down, driven into a granite rock the color of coarse salt, a cross with a date engraved below it, 1842. 71 years ago, someone had passed through here, carrying cargo valuable enough to mark the way for whoever came next. That path had history, it had stone witnesses, and it likely had a record in the municipal archives of the nearest town. The total descent down to the first cornfields at the foot of the mountain took 4 hours of exhausting effort. When August finally stepped onto flat ground, his knees throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, and his shoulders burned from the strain of keeping the mule straight on the steepest drops. But there was immense relief in the feeling of firm, level soil beneath his boots. He stopped near a creek and let the mule drink deeply, while he bent down to splash the freezing water onto his face, feeling the cold shock scatter the numbness of his fatigue. The first sign of civilization was the smell of wood smoke and cooking beans, wafting from a small property enclosed by a round log fence about 200 yards from the creek bank. An old, pot-bellied dog lifted its head lazily upon hearing him approach, growled a half-hearted warning, and went back to sleep in the meager midday sun. The owner of the property was a man in his 50s named Harlan, sun-baked, a man of few words with gold teeth that flashed when he smiled, which he did generously. Upon learning that August was the young man who had gone up White Pine Ridge with a town girl to try and build a farm on old Sebastian Miller's lot, Harlan threw his broad arms open and told him to come inside, saying a pot of beans with sausage had been ready for an hour, and it was a sin to eat alone. Sitting at a rustic walnut table with a plate of hot food in front of him for the first time in days, August told him about Nathaniel Vance's locked gate, the steel padlock, and the threatening sign. Harlan nodded slowly, the gold smile vanishing from his face, replaced by an expression of old, accumulated irritation. The man rubbed his calloused hands on his worn trousers and confirmed that Nathaniel had closed off that road without anyone's permission, hastily building that gate right when he heard a new settler was moving onto White Pine, terrified that the main spring would be contested during the late summer drought. Harlan stood up, went to a wooden chest in the corner of the room, and returned with a black-covered notebook old and its pages yellowed by time. He opened it to the middle pages and pointed to a list of names and dates handwritten in faded brown ink, explaining that this was an informal ledger his own grandfather had started, recording the paths and trails of the region, noting the dates drovers passed through and the names of the properties bordering each route. The road Nathaniel had blocked was right there, recorded under the name Deep River Road, dated 1842, identified as a path of common use for the mountain region. Harlan said, with a seriousness that contrasted with his affable nature, that he had tried taking the matter up with the town clerk once, but Nathaniel had friends in the courthouse, and the issue simply evaporated without a trace. He looked at August with narrowed eyes and added that the young carpenter should also know that the Pine Ridge Trail he had just descended was a pioneer route, registered in the archives of the Black Mountain Town Council since the early mining days, and that by law no private owner could block it, regardless of who their friends were down at the local clerk's office. That piece of information landed in August's chest with the weight of a 50-foot oak tree crashing to the forest floor. In town, the carpenter made his purchases with urgency but without being careless. Enough kerosene for 3 weeks of lantern light and heating, coarse salt, dried beans, cornmeal, canned lard, high-quality salted meat. Long iron nails for the roofing, lime mortar to seal the gaps in the roof, and a spool of twisted sisal rope he desperately needed to reinforce the stable structure. At the deputy clerk's office, a skinny young man with round glasses named Benjamin, who manned the desk when the senior clerk was out, August asked about the records of pioneer paths and public roads in the mountain region. Benjamin pushed up his glasses, raised an eyebrow, and left the room, returning minutes later carefully carrying a roll of aged paper. It was the county map of easements and right-of-ways, dated 1863, bearing the worn stamp of the state government. There it was, drawn in India ink with a dotted line winding exactly up the north flank of the ridge. Deep River Road, classified as a permanent public easement, which meant, in precise legal terms, that no private owner could block it under penalty of a judicial injunction and a severe fine. Benjamin made a copy on clean paper, signed and stamped it with the county seal, and handed it to August with a knowing look over the rim of his round glasses. He didn't charge a dime, saying only that he had grown up hearing stories about old Sebastian Miller, an honest man whose son deserved to be protected by the truth written in documents. The climb back up to White Pine Ridge with a fully loaded mule was the most grueling experience of August Miller's life. The snow had partially melted on the surface during the day, turning the rocks on the trail into a treacherous mix of clear ice and dark mud. Every 3 steps, the mule slipped and had to be righted with iron patience. August carried a leather pack on his shoulders, filled with the nails and lime, and in his right hand he held the machete to clear the sections where the thaw had created makeshift waterfalls over the stony path. The muscles in his thighs burned in a way he hadn't felt even during the first days of digging the foundation. The wind had calmed, but the temperature plummeted again as the sun set, and his breath plumed in thick white clouds as he hauled himself inch by inch up the vertical slope. He didn't think of quitting, not even once. Every agonizing step was taken with the image of the lantern light in the window, burned into his mind, that fragile golden dot waiting for him at the top. Cecilia had spent the hours of August's absence in a tense, productive vigil. She knew that sitting still and waiting would only let the fear grow unchallenged, so she assigned herself tasks with the methodical determination she had developed over months of hard labor. She completely reorganized their remaining food stock, making precise calculations on the back of some wrapping paper about exactly how many days of minimum rations each sack and tin could sustain them both. She walked the perimeter of the cabin inside, checking the walls and marking with charcoal any gaps that needed fresh mud. She fixed the loose handle on a hoe. She brewed an infusion of lemon balm and mint, sipping the hot liquid wrapped in the thickest blanket they owned. And when night fell for good, and the external cold battered against the oak doors like an insistent, ill-mannered guest, she picked up the wooden spoon August had carved, ran her thumb over the delicately sculpted leaves on the handle, and sat by the fire, feeding it sparingly to make the remaining wood last. There were moments during those hours when she allowed herself to look inward with the kind of honesty that mountain isolation teaches. She thought about her life in town, the fabric shop that no longer existed, the iron bed with a straw mattress in the back room she had called her bedroom. She thought of how many mornings she had woken up feeling that the world was too small to hold her vague, undefined dreams. And she thought of August, of the way he had knelt in the mud to clean her face without asking permission or apologizing, with that absurd gentleness, his rough hands kept hidden until the very moment it was needed. Of the way he looked at wood before cutting it, silently conversing with the material, listening to what the tree had been before deciding what it could become. Of the way, that night by the fire, he had placed his hand over hers on her shoulder with a softness that felt like a plea for forgiveness for a wrong he had never committed. She didn't have a name yet for what she felt, but she knew the weight of it was real, heavier and warmer than any southern wool blanket. On the third day of August's absence, with the firewood stock drastically low and anxiety gnawing at the edges of her patience, Cecilia heard the sound she had been waiting for. The recognizable whinny of the chestnut mule, that slightly raspy, complaining sound the animal made upon reaching the top of the incline. She was 20 feet from the door when the noise hit, and they were the fastest 20 feet her legs had ever covered in her life. She pulled the heavy oak door open with such force that it banged against the stone wall, leaving the iron handle's mark in the plaster, and ran out into the freezing outdoors without a shawl or blanket. August was crossing the last flat rock of the plateau, the loaded mule behind him, his eyes sunken and exhausted, his face lined with the strain of a 3-day journey. When he saw her running toward him, her dark hair loose in the cold wind and her eyes wide, he stopped dead in his tracks. The carpenter's heart skipped a full beat. She stopped 2 paces from him, her lungs burning from the icy air she had gasped in during her sprint, and looked at the exhausted man standing before her. August had dark, deep circles under his eyes, an ugly scratch on his right cheek where a branch had whipped his face during the descent, and his left boot was torn on the side. But his eyes, those dark, serious eyes that rarely yielded to fatigue, shone with something very much like the profound relief of a man who has finally made it back to where he belongs. He said in a hoarse, worn voice that he had gotten everything, the nails, the kerosene, the flour, and the salted meat, and that he had also brought something more valuable than any supplies. Cecilia took the final step separating them and threw her arms around him, holding the carpenter's broad, freezing shoulders in an embrace that asked neither for permission nor planning. August stood rigid for a fraction of a second, like a man who doesn't quite know what to do when something infinitely precious suddenly drops into his lap. Then, slowly, his heavy, exhausted arms rose around her back, pulling her in with a silent firmness. He held that embrace for a long time, his nose buried in her hair, feeling the heat of her head against his frozen chest, like the rare winter sun breaking over the cold stones of the Blue Ridge. That was the moment the last invisible walls remaining between them finally crumbled, without a sound, without ceremony, with only the complete, satisfied silence of arriving home. With their supplies restocked, the final race to finish the roof began with renewed, energetic urgency. The January sky had opened a rare 2-day window of weak but stable sunshine, the kind of reprieve the mountains granted from time to time, as if watching to see if mortals had the courage to seize the truce. They didn't waste a single minute. August climbed up and down the scaffolding with agility restored by rest and hot food. fitting the heavy wooden shingles onto the wooden frame with the precision of a craftsman who knows every measurement and angle of his work. Cecilia passed the shingles up from below in a rhythmic chain, placing each piece into the carpenter's waiting hands, then set to mixing the lime and sand mortar that would seal the battens and close the largest gaps. The rhythm between them was tuned like an instrument that had been played long enough to find its natural pitch. They no longer needed instructions or requests. A look, a hand gesture, or a nod of the head was enough to initiate the next step without interruption. At the end of the second sunny day, as the horizon painted the highest surrounding peaks in deep orange and violet, August climbed down from the scaffolding one last time, holding a simple object in his outstretched hand, the wooden ridge cap that would crown the very peak of the roof. Cecilia stood below, her hands covered in dry mortar, her face smudged with lime dust, her eyes wide as he climbed back up with the piece tucked into his belt. The silence on the plateau was absolute as he fitted the cap onto the highest point of the roof, sealing the final joint with a thick layer of white mortar. And then that simple piece of wood transformed into the crowning glory of months of sweat, pain, and determination that went far beyond the normal limits of human endurance. August stood motionless atop the scaffolding for a long moment, looking down at the completed roof stretching beneath his feet, the precise rows of shingles he and Cecilia had laid one by one. The feeling that washed over him had no clean, simple name. It was a mixture of gratitude, pride, profound exhaustion, and a joy so dense it tightened his throat like tears held back for far too long. He climbed down the scaffolding slowly, and when his boots touched the ground, Cecilia was standing in front of him, her eyes shining dangerously bright. She pointed to the roof and said, her voice thick with emotion, that he had finished it. August looked up, then looked at her, and answered in a very low voice that they had finished it together. The difference in that small correction meant the whole world. Tonight, if you still haven't subscribed to the Tales of Yesteryear channel, this is the perfect moment to do so, because we are approaching the most emotional moments of this beautiful story of love and resilience that Cecilia and August lived in the mountains, and you won't want to miss the ending they deserve after fighting so hard together. That very same night, for the first time since they had come up White Pine Ridge, the rain that began falling outside did not come inside the cabin. It struck the shingled roof with a full musical sound, ran down the wooden eaves, and splashed onto the ground outside exactly as it was meant to. The dry walls and closed roof transformed the main room into a haven of real warmth, heated by the stone fireplace August had lit with dry, fragrant cedar wood. The first time the fireplace in that house was working exactly as planned. The smell of sweet smoke and good wood burning slowly filled every corner of the room, blending with the scent of dry clay from the walls and the beeswax Cecilia had rubbed into the wide wooden floorboards that afternoon. It was the smell of a home, a smell of permanence. August went to the leather travel bag, hanging on a nail behind the door, and pulled out, with the care of someone handling a relic, a dark glass bottle with a cork stopper. The paper label, handwritten in tiny script, read simply 1908 vintage wine, with the name Sebastian Miller scribbled on the back. He held the bottle for a long moment, his fingers wrapped around the cold glass, staring at the tag written by his father's hand. Cecilia approached quietly, observing the man's face and immediately understanding the weight of the object, without needing an explanation. She lightly touched the side of the bottle next to his hands and asked in a very soft voice if old Sebastian had said when it should be opened. August took a deep breath, the answer coming slowly, like someone finding a lost memory in a forgotten corner, and told her that his father had wrapped the bottle in burlap and hidden it at the bottom of his pack the day he handed over the deed to the land, saying only that it was to be drunk when the roof of the White Pine cabin was closed, because that would be the day an old man's dream became reality in the hands of a young man. Cecilia took 2 enamel mugs from the iron hook she had installed near the fireplace, placed them on the rustic, wide-plank table August had built that week, and said with firm sweetness that old Sebastian was as present in this moment as any living man could be, and that the 2 of them would honor his dream by drinking that wine with the dignity he deserved. August uncorked the bottle with slightly trembling hands, poured the dark, heavy wine into the 2 enamel mugs, and raised his toward the finished ceiling. They didn't say a toast. They just both looked up at the wooden roof that had cost them so much, drank in silence, and the wine had a strong, slightly sweet taste, soaked in time, that went down warming every part of the path it traveled. The conversation that followed during that long night was different from all the previous ones. There was no longer the urgency of work waiting, nor the tension of a looming storm, nor the shadow of Nathaniel Vance hanging like a thundercloud over their plans. There was only the fire, old Sebastian's faint wine, the rain on the closed roof, and 2 human beings who had spent months side by side through exhaustion and struggle, discovering that a closeness forged in sweat and hardship held a different, deeper quality than any connection the comfortable, civilized world of the town could ever provide. August talked about his youth in Black Mountain, about his years learning woodworking from an old master who taught more by example than by words, about the first time he had cut a perfect joint without a single nail, just wood on wood, and the real, physical satisfaction that had brought to the backs of his hands. Cecilia listened to every word with the absolute attention of someone who recognizes in another soul the traces of her own language, and when he finished, she talked about the poetry book she had kept in her battered suitcase, the only possession she chose to save when the bank took everything, and how the words in those books had always seemed to her a form of construction as precise as carpentry, bricks of meaning slotted together carefully to hold up something that otherwise would have nowhere to stand. August looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she had never seen on his stern face, something between awe and profound recognition, and said quietly that he hadn't realized until that moment how the 2 of them did the exact same thing in completely different ways. Cecilia felt the warmth of his words spread through her chest like the hot wine, and she smiled a smile that wasn't polite or shy, but the smile of someone who feels truly seen for the very first time. The morning that followed dawned clear and biting, with the January sun casting diamonds of light across the thin sheet of ice covering the grass. August woke before dawn, as he always did, but for a while he just lay on his blanket, listening to the breathing of the house, the slow creak of the wood warming in the rising sun, the gentle wind tapping against the glass windows. It was a different sound from the tarp camps, different from the nights in the makeshift lean-to. It was the sound of a living house. He was in the kitchen brewing coffee when he heard the horse hooves again, this time with the sun well above the eastern peaks of the ridge. The sound was unmistakable and old as an unwanted warning. 2 horses, steady pace, heading toward the plateau. August stopped stirring the coffee with his wooden spoon, felt the muscles in his back harden involuntarily, and went to the door, opening it with controlled calm. From the field to his left, he saw Cecilia, who had gone out to fetch firewood, also standing perfectly still with a bundle in her arms, her eyes fixed on the crest of the slope. Nathaniel Vance emerged from the morning mist, riding the same black horse as before, better dressed, neater, which meant he had planned this visit carefully. The foreman rode behind, this time without an envelope in hand, but maintaining the posture of a silent bodyguard. Nathaniel stopped his horse about 50 feet from the door, looked at the cabin with its completed ridge cap gleaming atop the closed roof, and his expression, for a fleeting instant before he managed to mask it, revealed genuine shock. That house was standing, it was finished, and it was there to stay. The rancher dismounted with the studied elegance of men who learn to use manners as tools of power. He walked toward August with his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes evaluating every detail of the construction with the objectivity of a man who understood structures and land. He said, in the voice of someone delivering a compliment that pained him to give, that the young carpenter was indeed a competent craftsman and that the cabin was well built for the conditions they had faced. Nathaniel stopped a few yards from August, eye to eye, and added that perhaps he had judged the couple's capabilities too soon. There was a tiny but real opening in his words, the concession pragmatic men make when they realize their initial strategy has failed and they need to recalculate their route. August listened to the speech in total silence, with Cecilia now standing beside him, the bundle of firewood still in her arms, her chin held high with the same elegant stubbornness she had displayed months ago in the rainy town. When Nathaniel finished speaking, the carpenter walked calmly into the house, opened the leather bag he had brought from town, and returned holding a folded piece of paper in his large hands. He unfolded it carefully, shielding it from the light morning wind, and handed it to the rancher without a word. Nathaniel took the paper with an eyebrow raised in controlled curiosity. His eyes scanned the sheet quickly, then reread it more slowly, his frown deepening with every line. It was the certified copy of the county map of easements and right-of-ways, with Deep River Road clearly marked as a permanent public easement, dated 1863. Complete with the signature and stamp of the municipal clerk, August crossed his arms over his chest, his gaze direct and absolutely serene, and explained, with the calm voice of someone who doesn't need to shout to be heard, that the gate built across Deep River Road was blocking a public way registered 70 years ago in the county archives, which constituted, according to what the deputy clerk had so generously explained, the illegal obstruction of a public easement, carrying a penalty of heavy fines and a judicial injunction from the state government. He added, without taking his eyes off the rancher's increasingly tense face, that he hadn't gone to the sheriff or the county prosecutor because he preferred to settle matters between neighbors in good faith, like the civilized men the mountain demanded they be. Nathaniel folded the paper with movements far too controlled to be natural, his jaw working silently for a long moment. He looked at Cecilia, who met his gaze unblinking, and then turned back to August. The rancher said, after a silence that lasted long enough for the wind to change direction twice, that he recognized the validity of the document. August let the silence settle over that statement for an appropriate amount of time, and then proposed the agreement with the direct, fair voice he had learned from his father. He said that the spring on White Pine Ridge gave pure, plentiful water, born from the oldest granite rocks on the mountain, and that in years of severe drought, the cattle on the lowland ranches suffered from thirst even before August arrived. He proposed, looking the rancher in the eye with a tranquility that wasn't arrogance, but was definitively unshakable, that Deep River Road be reopened immediately and permanently, without padlocks and without threats, guaranteeing free passage to anyone who needed to cross the mountain. In exchange for this guarantee of peace and absolute respect for the borders of the Miller property, August would allow Nathaniel Vance's cattle-controlled access to a smaller branch of the spring that flowed down to the southern border of the plateau during the cruelest months of the dry season. He explained that he had no interest in watching animals die of thirst, nor did he want to start a fence war that would poison the land for future generations, but that he demanded unconditional respect for his home and his family. The silence following the proposal was thick and fraught with silent calculations. Nathaniel Vance was a ruthless businessman, but he was no fool blinded by his own vanity. He looked at the document bearing the state seal, looked at the solid posture of the carpenter who hadn't backed up an inch, and then looked at the stone and timber cabin that had survived the most brutal blizzard of the decade. The old rancher realized that this young man wasn't a dreaming adventurer who would flee at the first sign of trouble, but a man forged on the same unforgiving anvil that had shaped the original pioneers of these mountains. With a long sigh that seemed to deflate some of the tension built up in the freezing yard, Nathaniel folded the document and handed it back to August. He extended his right hand, sheathed in fine leather, and stated in a voice that had finally abandoned its tone of superiority that the deal was sealed, and the gate on the main road would be dismantled before sundown that very day. The rancher added, with a slight bow of his head towards Cecilia, that the mountain had chosen its owners wisely, and he wished the young couple luck. When Nathaniel and his foreman mounted their horses and began their descent, slowly disappearing around the bend of the dirt and stone road, the sound of the hooves faded until it was completely swallowed by the whistle of the wind through the hemlock canopy. August remained motionless, his eyes tracking the spot where the riders had vanished, until he was absolutely certain the threat had dissipated for good. Cecilia, who had been holding her breath for far too long, let the bundle of firewood slip from her arms, the wood clattering to the ground with a dull thud that broke the trance of the moment. The reality of their victory crashed over them with the weight of an entire mountain being lifted from their shoulders. They had won. The house was finished. The winter had been tamed, and no one, absolutely no one, was going to take this land from them. August turned slowly towards Cecilia, his broad shoulders finally relaxing, his breath coming in ragged puffs of pure, intoxicating relief. He took a step toward her, then another, until he was close enough to see the morning sun reflecting in the young woman's almond eyes. The carpenter's hands, which hadn't trembled before the snowstorm nor the powerful rancher, now shook slightly as he raised his arms and held Cecilia's face with a gentleness that contrasted brutally with his calloused, rough palms. He whispered her name in a choked voice, a sound that carried months of suppressed fears, sleepless nights, spilled sweat, and an affection that had grown in silence, rooting itself in his soul with the strength of a centuries-old oak. Cecilia closed her eyes as she felt the warm touch of those hands, the hot tears she had held back all morning finally spilling over, wetting the thick fingers of the man who had saved her from ruin. She raised her own hands, covering his, and replied in a tearful murmur that they had done it, that the nightmare was over, and that White Pine Ridge was now truly their home. The world around them seemed to stop spinning, the wind lost its biting edge, and the morning cold became entirely irrelevant. Without either of them needing to formulate a request or an elaborate declaration, August slowly tilted his face down, closing the final barrier of distance that still existed between them. Their first kiss tasted of the salt of Cecilia's tears and the intense heat of a fire that had been tended with patience and respect through the hardest months of their lives. It wasn't a rushed or desperate kiss, but a profound and immensely tender encounter, a silent confirmation that all the unspoken promises made between wooden beams and mud bricks were real and permanent. Cecilia wrapped her arms around the carpenter's neck, pulling him closer, feeling the solidness of his body as the safest anchor she had ever found in the world. When they pulled apart, just enough to breathe the thin mountain air, August rested his forehead against hers, his dark eyes shining with a new, overwhelming intensity. He declared, his deep voice trembling with emotion, that he had promised to give her half of this land and build a strong roof to protect her. But the undeniable truth was that his heart had belonged entirely to her since the day he watched her brave the mountain without shedding a single tear. Cecilia smiled, a radiant, unguarded smile that lit up the entire plateau, and answered that the home she wanted wasn't made of stone or wood, but of his embrace, and that she would stand by his side on this mountain until the very last of her days. With peace finally established and the certainty of requited love warming their hearts, the rest of the winter seemed to lose its cruelty. The weeks passed in a quiet routine filled with small domestic joys. August dedicated himself to building the furniture missing from the cabin's interior, transforming hardwood into polished tables, sturdy chairs, and a spacious, firm bed adorned with floral carvings he whittled by the fire at night. Cecilia, in turn, transformed the rustic space into a true sanctuary of comfort. She sewed light cotton curtains for the windows, stuffed the mattresses with clean straw and dried sweetgrass to give them a soothing, fresh scent, and organized the kitchen with a meticulous care that reflected her inner happiness. The dynamic between them was one of such perfect partnership that words often became unnecessary. A simple glance over morning coffee or a soft brush of hands as they passed through the doorway was enough to reaffirm the immense love that bound them. The freezing dawn hours were no longer frightening because they faced them together, protected under the same roof, warmed by the same fire, wrapped in the same thick woolen blanket, sharing dreams and planning the promising future unfolding on the horizon. When the month of April arrived, the Blue Ridge Mountains began to wake from their long white and grey slumber. The ice packed into the corners of the rocks melted quickly, turning into singing little streams that rushed down the mountain. The fields of golden grass took on vibrant shades of fresh green, and the old wild rose bushes near the edge of the plateau exploded in red and pink buds. Spring brought with it the sweet perfume of fertile earth and wildflowers, bathing the property in a warm golden light that healed bones weary from the winter. It was time to open the earth to new life. Cecilia and August worked together on the gentlest slope, hoeing the rich, dark soil and planting with reverent care the seeds of corn, beans, and pumpkin that Widow Tucker had given them months before. The act of sowing, of placing a promise of life into the damp earth and covering it with mud-stained hands, was the perfect metaphor for what they had done with their own hearts. Physical labor was no longer a desperate battle for survival against the deadly cold, but joyful, hopeful work, accompanied by easy conversation, free laughter, and plans for an apple and peach orchard August wanted to plant the following year. In the second half of May, with the first green shoots bravely sprouting from the black soil of the garden, White Pine Ridge received long-awaited and dearly loved visitors. Widow Tucker and Old Harlan rode up the main trail on calm mules, their saddlebags bursting with gifts, fresh cheeses, pumpkin preserves, and seasonal fruit jams. Nathaniel Vance's gate lay open, honoring the agreement struck, and the path was free and safe. Their reunion in the yard of the new home was a loud, warm celebration, full of tight hugs and words of admiration. Eleanor walked through the stone and timber cabin, running her wrinkled hand over the solid walls and polished wooden furniture, her eyes shining with pure pride. She sat in the rocking chair August had just finished building and declared, with a wide, wise smile, that this house had the most beautiful, strongest soul in the whole mountain range, and that the love between the two of them was carved into every piece of clay and every shingle on the roof. Old Harlan, drinking the strong coffee Cecilia had just brewed, clapped the carpenter's broad shoulder and said that the couple's story was already spreading through the town below. Not as gossip, but as a legend of respect. The tale of the young carpenter and the brave girl who tamed the winter and the rich rancher without firing a single shot. It was exactly on that sunlit spring afternoon, with their two most loyal friends the mountain had given them, standing as witnesses, that August made his official proposal. He waited until everyone was gathered on the rustic porch overlooking the immense, verdant valley stretching out below them. His face flushed with a shyness that time had not entirely erased. He pulled a small wooden box he had carved himself from his cotton vest pocket. Inside rested a ring made not of gold or silver, but from the purest, darkest heartwood of a black walnut tree, sanded until it shone like a rare jewel, a continuous, unbreakable circle. The carpenter looked deeply into Cecilia's eyes, and with a clear voice full of monumental certainty, asked if she would agree to join her life with his before God and the law, so that their name would be one on this land forever. Emotion overtook the young woman with such force that she could barely form the answer in words, simply nodding her head dozens of times as tears of joy washed her smiling face. Eleanor clapped her hands in delight, and old Harlan removed his hat in a gesture of solemn respect for the sacred moment unfolding before them. The wedding took place a month later, on a radiant day in June, when the sky was a blue so deep it seemed infinite. The ceremony wasn't held in the lavish town church, where the clerk and the banker usually sat in the front pews, but right there, in the green yard of White Pine Ridge, under the protective shade of a massive hemlock tree. The elderly parish priest agreed to make the long climb on Harlan's mule, moved by the story of perseverance and honesty surrounding the young couple. Cecilia wore a simple light cotton dress, trimmed with fine lace she had carefully saved herself, and a crown of white wildflowers braided into her dark hair. August wore a linen suit Harlan had lent him, his posture straight, shoulders broad, and his heart beating with serene strength. The exchange of vows was made to the sound of the gentle wind rustling the leaves around them, promising loyalty, protection, patience, and eternal love. When the priest spoke the final words, blessing their union, and August slipped the walnut ring onto Cecilia's finger, kissing her hand with devotion, a flock of birds took flight from the nearby trees, as if nature itself was celebrating the consolidation of that love which had been born in mud and suffering, and now blossomed in the beauty of spring. The years following the wedding flowed like the clear waters of the creek, cutting across the plateau, constant, pure, and filled with a vital, transformative energy. The property thrived on the honest sweat and intelligent labor of them both. The modest garden expanded into fertile fields of corn and beans, the apple and peach orchard took root on the sunny slope, and the small pasture housed dairy cows that guaranteed a bountiful table. But the true wealth of that house was not measured in sacks of grain or the wheels of cheese they began selling in town, but in the absolute peace and the atmosphere of unconditional love that reigned within the stone and timber walls. The harmony between August and Cecilia was deep and unshakable. They built a life based on dialogue, mutual support, and profound respect for each other's strengths and limits. The indirect flirting and passionate glances of their building days evolved into a mature partnership, where a simple touch on the shoulder during chores or a smile exchanged over the wood stove carried the exact same weight as 1,000 romantic declarations. The universe seemed to bless their union with the greatest and most beautiful of gifts on a luminous day in September of 1918, when the strong, vigorous cry of a newborn child echoed for the first time against the stone walls of the cabin. Widow Tucker, who had come up the mountain days prior to help with the birth, placed the healthy, pink, energetic baby boy into Cecilia's arms, tears of pure emotion streaming down her weather-beaten face. He was a strong boy, named Theodore in honor of his grandfather, carrying in his eyes the same sharp intelligence of his mother, and in his posture the serene strength of his father. The birth of their son brought an even more intense, vibrant layer of light to White Pine Ridge. There was no room for sadness, fear, or dark hardships in that home. The boy grew up surrounded by immense love, lulled by the sound of the lullabies Cecilia sang softly, and the old stories August told, while he carved small wooden toys for his son. The house was flooded daily with childish laughter, healthy play, and the pure joy of a family that knew how to cherish every second of life. 2 years later, their happiness multiplied with the arrival of little Aurora, a girl with curly hair and an easy smile, healthy and radiant as a ray of morning sunlight. The childhood of those children was a true rustic fairy tale, unfolding in absolute safety, peace and health. They grew up running through the flowered fields, learning from their father to respect the time of the trees and the value of honest labor, and learning from their mother a love of reading, poetry, and kindness to others. There were no real threats, no cruel accidents, no severe illnesses, just the pure experience of childhood in its most beautiful, natural state. August built perfect swings from the low branches of the hemlock trees, and Cecilia organized picnics on hot summer days, spreading a checkered blanket over the soft grass. Seeing Theodore and Aurora grow up strong, respectful and deeply loved was the daily confirmation that the decision they had made years ago, to not give up on this mountain and face the winter head-on, had been the most right and divine choice of their existence. The home that began as a gamble against despair had become an impregnable fortress of familial love and hope, a place where only good things and happy memories dared to take root. Time, which had once been an enemy to fight in the race against the blizzard and frosts, now passed like a benevolent, gentle friend, painting August and Cecilia's hair silver without ever stealing the sweetness from their gazes or the firmness of their clasped hands. The decades rolled smoothly by. We arrive at the autumn of 1950. The world down below had changed drastically. The small town of Black Mountain had grown, railroads crossed the valleys, the roar of early engines began to replace the braying of mules, and electric lights outshone the stars over the city. But high up on White Pine Ridge, the essence of the place remained unchanged, protected by an aura of sacred peace and preserved time. The property was now a prosperous, lush, impeccably maintained farm. Theodore had become a respected agronomist and a loving family man, and Aurora, a dedicated teacher at the new town school, both returning to the mountain every weekend to fill the yard with the noise of healthy grandchildren and endless games. The main house had been expanded with comfortable bedrooms and wide porches, but the original room, the one where they faced that first winter, remained intact and untouched, the beating heart of the family's history. On a golden, quiet afternoon, August and Cecilia were sitting side by side on the wide wooden porch, watching the sun slowly dip behind the blue peaks of the Appalachian Mountains. August was now in his 60s, his face marked by the deep, dignified lines that only a life of hard work and true love can carve. His hair completely white, but his hands still steady and his posture still proud. Cecilia, possessing a serene beauty that age does not erase but merely transforms into calm elegance, kept her woolen shawl over her shoulders and a book of poetry resting in her lap. The silence between them wasn't the tense silence of strangers on that first journey, but the comforting symphony of souls who had already said everything that mattered and who now simply enjoyed the marvel of each other's company. August lifted his aged hand, found Cecilia's fingers resting on the arm of the rocking chair, and squeezed them with the exact same gentleness and strength of 40 years ago. He looked at the green pastures, at the robust trees he had planted with his own hands, and finally looked at the woman who was the most important foundation of everything he called his life. The old carpenter sighed, a long, peaceful sound, and said in a low voice, a tender smile playing on his lips, that the clerk and the rich rancher had been wrong about the strength of the mountains. He stated, looking deeply into the eyes that still held the same brilliant stubbornness of her youth, that it wasn't the foundation stones or the thick timber of the roof that stopped the cold from destroying them, but the certainty that with every nail driven and every bit of mud packed, they were sculpting the affection they felt for one another. Cecilia squeezed his hand in return, rested her silver head on the broad shoulder that had always been her safe harbor, and whispered that the truest love of all isn't the kind you find ready-made in the easy parts of the world, but the kind you choose to build from scratch, with absurd patience, brick by brick, in the highest and hardest heights of life. Because only then does it grow roots strong enough to last an entire eternity and become a beacon for those who follow. And there, under the golden evening light that painted the sky with hope and permanence, the couple who tamed the mountain and raised an empire of affection out of nothing remained united, proving forever that the greatest, most majestic and unshakable work any human being can raise on the face of this earth is, and will always be, the beautiful story of a love built to last,